The air in the third-floor conference room of the Lubyanka was thick with the smoke of cheap Soviet cigarettes and unspoken failure. It was late, well past midnight in the winter of 1982, and the men of the KGB's second chief directorate, the guardians of the state's internal security, stared at the documents spread across the long, polished table. These weren't reports of dissident poets or black market traders. They were pristine, high-resolution photographs of technical schematics, pages of intricate data on radar systems and avionics that were supposed to be locked away in the most secure design bureaus in the entire Soviet Union. For 3 years, this poison had been seeping out. The Americans, somehow, knew things they shouldn't. They knew the exact performance envelopes of the new MiG-29 fighter before it had even completed its state trials. They knew the weaknesses in the Zaslon phased array radar, the very heart of the formidable MiG-31 interceptor. The men in this room were the best counterintelligence officers in the world, masters of a city they had turned into a fortress of surveillance. Yet, a ghost was walking through their walls, and they were utterly, terrifyingly baffled. They had no suspect, no lead, no explanation. It was as if the information was simply evaporating from their most secret vaults and materializing in Langley, Virginia. The assembled officers, veterans of a brutal and effective system, could not comprehend it. Their entire doctrine was built on the principle of total control, and for the first time they were facing an enemy they couldn't see, couldn't find, and couldn't even begin to understand. This impossible breach of security, a phantom haunting the most secure city on Earth, is a story that has been buried for decades. This is the kind of story we uncover every week here at Cold War Impact. Subscribe now, so you don't miss the truth behind the secrets. To understand the depth of the KGB's shock, you must first understand the world they had built. Soviet Moscow, in the late 1970s and early 80s, was not merely a city, it was a perfectly constructed surveillance state, an organism designed with a single purpose, to prevent secrets from escaping and enemies from operating within. The KGB's confidence wasn't arrogance, it was a belief grounded in a system of suffocating, total control. The second chief directorate, along with the formidable 7th Directorate, commanded an army of watchers. Thousands of plainclothes agents, the infamous Tolkachi, or foot-pounders, were assigned to trail every single Western diplomat, journalist, and businessman from the moment they left their gated compounds. These were not amateurs. They were professionals trained in the subtle arts of the follow, masters of blending into crowds, of handing off a target from one team to another so seamlessly that the target would never know. They drove anonymous Lada and Volga sedans, their dashboards dotted with hidden switches for radio communication, their minds a perfect map of the city's back alleys and courtyards. Their human network was bolstered by a technological one. The listening posts in buildings overlooking the American embassy were manned 24 hours a day. Microphones were everywhere, not just in hotel rooms, but embedded in the very walls of apartments, rented to foreigners, in the bases of decorative lamps, in the heels of shoes left for repair. Every phone line was tapped as a matter of course. The mail was opened, read, photographed, and resealed by experts in Building K of the Lubyanka complex. Furthermore, the entire Soviet population was weaponized as an extension of the state's eyes and ears. A network of millions of citizen informants, the sexots, reported on their neighbors, their co-workers, even their own family members. A suspicious conversation, a neighbor living slightly beyond their means, a light on at an odd hour, everything was noted, everything was filed. This was the reality of the Brezhnev-era doctrine of no secrets. The KGB genuinely believed their capital was an impenetrable fortress, a human and electronic panopticon from which no spy could operate for more than a few days before being identified, tracked, and ultimately neutralized. They had caught American agents before, and they were confident they would always catch them. The idea that a high-level mole could operate for years, passing military secrets of the highest classification from the very heart of their defense industry, wasn't just unlikely. In their worldview, it was a structural impossibility. They would have laughed at the suggestion. Across the ocean, in the quiet, wooded campus of Langley, Virginia, the CIA's Soviet division shared the KGB's assessment, but from the opposite perspective. Moscow was known simply as the hardest target. For years, the attempt to run human intelligence operations there had been a story of catastrophic failure. Case officers working under diplomatic cover at the US Embassy were suffocated by the KGB's constant overt surveillance. It was a psychological war. Their cars were followed, their apartments were bugged, their every move was scrutinized. Attempting to meet a potential asset was a nightmare. A simple brush pass on a crowded street, a dead drop in a park. The bread and butter of espionage were nearly impossible tasks in a city where every park bench seemed to have a KGB spotter and every street cleaner might be reporting your license plate. The CIA had tried. They had sent in brave men and women, but the KGB's defenses were too thick. Agents were caught, some were executed. Others were paraded on television in humiliating propaganda victories for the Soviet state. By the late 1972, a deep sense of pessimism had settled over the division. Moscow was, for all intents and purposes, a denied area. But American policy, forged in the crucible of the Cold War, was not one of passive acceptance. If the old methods weren't working, new ones had to be devised. The American advantage had always been its ability to innovate, not just technologically, but doctrinally. The CIA knew they couldn't beat the KGB at their own game of brute force surveillance. They couldn't put more men on the street or build a better network of informants inside Moscow. They had to change the game entirely. The new, unspoken policy was one of patience and opportunity. Instead of trying to force their way in, they would wait for someone on the inside to reach out. They needed a volunteer, a walk-in. This was a spy chief's fantasy. A high-level Soviet official, disillusioned with the corrupt and decaying communist system, who would willingly risk everything to betray his country. The odds were astronomical. The personal risk for such an individual was absolute. Discovery meant a cold basement, a single gunshot to the back of the head, and erasure from history. Yet, the CIA began to shift its operational focus. They developed new, incredibly sophisticated pieces of covert communication technology, devices that could be concealed in plain sight. They refined their tradecraft for the briefest, most fleeting moments of contact. They prepared the Moscow station not for aggressive recruitment, but for the day the impossible might happen. They were building a net, hoping that a prize fish would one day swim into it. In 1977, that day arrived. A man approached a CIA officer's car at a gas station in Moscow and dropped a note through the window. He was a senior engineer at a top-secret Soviet military aviation design bureau. He had access to everything, and he wanted to help the West. The Americans never knew for sure if it was real or an elaborate KGB trap, but the potential reward was so immense, they decided to take the risk. This was the birth of the Ghost, the genesis of an operation so secret and so successful that it would drive the masters of the Lubyanka to the edge of paranoia. They were looking for a CIA super spy, a master of disguise and infiltration. They never knew the truth, the reality that was so much more terrifying. The American advantage wasn't a person they had sent in. It was a sickness that had grown from within their own system. The first signs were subtle, easily dismissed as coincidences or the product of lucky guesswork by Western intelligence. In 1979, during a tense standoff between Soviet and American naval forces in the North Atlantic, a US Navy P-3 Orion patrol aircraft executed a series of maneuvers that seemed to perfectly anticipate the tactics of a new Soviet submarine. The sub's captain, a decorated hero of the Soviet Union, reported that the Americans flew as if they had his operational manual open in their cockpit. The report was filed away, noted as an anomaly. A few months later, a NATO intelligence summary, passed to the GRU through a source in Brussels, contained a paragraph analyzing the frequency-hopping capabilities of a new Soviet air defense radar. The analysis was alarmingly accurate. The GRU, the military's intelligence directorate, accused the KGB of a lapse in security. The KGB, in turn, dismissed it as a lucky intercept by a high-flying American signals intelligence plane. From the Lubyanka's perspective, these were minor irritations, predictable outcomes in the great game of espionage. Their initial reaction was one of professional disdain. They believed the Americans were clumsy, relying on brute force technology because they lacked the sophisticated human intelligence networks the KGB commanded. The idea that this information was coming from a single high-level human source inside their own defense establishment was simply not entertained. It was laughable. A preliminary investigation was opened, but it was routine, almost lazy. The second chief directorate assigned a handful of mid-level officers to review the security protocols at the Phasotron Design Bureau, the facility responsible for the radar. They interviewed a few janitors, reviewed the logs of foreign visitors from 2 years prior, and concluded their report by recommending an upgrade to the perimeter fence. They were confident they were dealing with a minor leak, a disgruntled technician perhaps, who had sold a few low-level documents for a bottle of vodka and a pair of blue jeans. They were sure they would find him, make an example of him, and close the file within a month. They couldn't believe their fortress had a flaw, because in their minds, it was perfect. The moment their world shattered came not with a bang, but with a quiet, horrifyingly technical briefing in the spring of 1980. The head of the PVO, the Soviet Air Defense Forces, a man whose chest was heavy with medals earned defending the motherland, stood before the KGB Collegium. His face was pale, his voice tight with a mixture of fury and fear. He held up a single sheet of paper. It was a transcript of a communication intercepted by a Soviet listening post in Tokyo between a US Air Force pilot and his command base. The American pilot, in a casual, almost bored tone, was confirming his ability to bypass the IFF, the Identify Friend or Foe system of the Soviet Union's most advanced interceptor, the MiG-25. He wasn't just jamming it, he was spoofing it. He was describing, with perfect accuracy, how to send a signal that would make his F-15 Eagle appear on Soviet radar screens as a friendly returning bomber. The silence in the room was absolute. The cigar smoke hung motionless. The implications were catastrophic, a strategic nightmare made real. It meant that at any moment, the entire American Strategic Air Command could penetrate Soviet airspace, and the first warning the defenders would have is when nuclear fire began raining down on their cities. The IFF codes weren't just secret, they were the holy of holies, the electronic keys to the kingdom. They were changed constantly, known only to a tiny, vetted handful of men at the very highest levels of the defense ministry. The leak wasn't a crack in the wall. The entire wall had ceased to exist. The KGB officers were stunned. The smug confidence of a few months prior evaporated, replaced by a cold, sickening dread. They were staring at a ghost who had handed their greatest enemy a master key to their front door. This was not the work of a disgruntled technician. This was a betrayal of unimaginable scale and sophistication. The GRU generals in the room looked at their KGB counterparts with undisguised contempt. The protectors had failed. The fortress had been breached, not by force, but by a phantom they had arrogantly ignored. The initial reaction of mockery towards American intelligence tradecraft curdled into a new, terrifying respect. They had never known the CIA was capable of this. Their entire operational playbook was useless. How do you follow a ghost? How do you surveil a man who leaves no trace? The immediate aftermath was a convulsion of paranoia that seized the entire Soviet military-industrial complex. The investigation, codenamed Operation Pauk or Spider, was launched with unlimited authority. Teams of the KGB's most ruthless investigators descended on Phasotron and other key research institutes. They sealed entire buildings. They placed hundreds of the nation's most brilliant scientists and engineers under round-the-clock surveillance. Polygraph machines were run until they broke down. The lives of these men, once the privileged elite of Soviet society, became a living hell. They were followed, their phones tapped, their mail read, their friends and families interrogated. Careers were destroyed on the basis of a misplaced word or a hint of Western sympathies. The trust that holds any complex organization together was annihilated, replaced by a pervasive fear. Every man looked at his colleague and wondered, "Is it you?" The KGB was tearing its own institutions apart in a desperate, frantic search for the source of the poison. They were baffled, they were horrified, and their belief in their own omniscience was shattered. They now knew the truth. There was a traitor walking among their most trusted men, and he was, for all intents and purposes, invisible. What the KGB leadership failed to grasp, even after the initial shock of the IFF code breach, was the true nature of the disaster unfolding. They treated it as a single catastrophic event, a wound that could be cauterized and healed. They believed their aggressive investigation, Operation Pauk, would eventually find the traitor and the flow of information would stop. They were wrong. The Americans hadn't just gotten lucky. They had established a system. The volunteer, the man the CIA codenamed Adolf Tolkachev, was not a one-time source. He was a permanent, reliable, high-bandwidth pipeline of intelligence flowing directly from the heart of the Soviet war machine. This wasn't a leak, it was a hemorrhage. The CIA, recognizing the unprecedented value of their asset, built a sophisticated and highly disciplined operational structure around him. The Moscow station was transformed. Its case officers, once frustrated and exposed, now operated with a new singular purpose: to service Tolkachev. They developed new dead-drop techniques, using specially designed containers that could survive the harsh Moscow winters. They invented short-range burst transmission radios for covert communication, devices that looked like ordinary pocket calculators. The entire American intelligence effort in Moscow became a support system for this one man, a systematic enterprise dedicated to extracting the secrets he was so eager to provide. The KGB, hunting for a lone spy, never realized they were fighting an entire, streamlined industrial process of espionage, one that was becoming more efficient and more devastating with each passing month. The initial shock didn't fade. It became the new, horrifying norm. The Americans didn't just know one secret. It seemed they now knew everything. This new reality was hammered home through a relentless series of strategic blows, each one landing with the force of an unanswerable question. The first case study in this new era of helplessness involved the development of the Soviets' next-generation airborne radar. For years, Soviet military doctrine had been haunted by the threat of low-flying American cruise missiles and B-52 bombers designed to fly under their radar coverage. The answer was a revolutionary look-down divided by shoot-down system, a radar so powerful and sophisticated it could be mounted on a MiG fighter and detect small targets against the clutter of the ground below. It was a technological marvel, the key to making Soviet airspace impenetrable. Billions of rubles were poured into the project at the Phasotron Institute. In 1981, Tolkachev, one of the leading engineers on the project, began passing the entire program to the CIA. Not just a few documents, but everything. The complete schematics, the performance specifications of the processors, the precise frequencies it operated on, its vulnerabilities to jamming, and even the training manuals for the pilots. The KGB was completely unaware. Then, they were shocked when reports began filtering in from their spies in NATO. American and British aerospace firms had suddenly, and with inexplicable speed, begun developing new electronic countermeasure, ECM, pods for their fighter jets. These pods were not general-purpose jammers, they were tailored with surgical precision to exploit the exact weaknesses of the new Soviet radar. The Soviets had planned to unveil their groundbreaking technology and dominate the skies for a decade. Instead, by the time the first production models were rolling off the assembly line, the West already had the antidote. The KGB was forced to watch, as their multi-billion-ruble technological triumph was neutralized before it was even deployed. They had been outmaneuvered, their best minds checkmated by an opponent who seemed to know their every move in advance. The second case study was even more terrifying, as it struck at the core of their strategic deterrent. The Tupolev Tu-160 Blackjack was the pride of the Soviet aviation industry, a supersonic, variable sweep-wing strategic bomber designed to be the equal of the American B-1. It was a symbol of Soviet power, a magnificent machine meant to project force across the globe. As the first prototypes were undergoing secret flight testing, Tolkachev delivered a treasure trove of intelligence to the CIA. He provided detailed satellite imagery timelines, revealing the program's production schedule. He handed over blueprints of its unique airframe, analyses of the radar-absorbent materials used in its construction, and, most critically, the GRU's top-secret plans for its operational basing. The KGB's counterintelligence teams, already stretched thin, were horrified by the consequences. Suddenly, American KH-11 reconnaissance satellites began making inexplicable orbital adjustments. They would shift their focus to a remote, seemingly insignificant airfield in Central Asia for a few days, and then move on. Weeks later, that same airfield would become the temporary home for a Tu-160 prototype undergoing critical performance trials. The Americans weren't just guessing. They knew the bomber's itinerary better than most of the officials in the Soviet Air Force. For the KGB, this was a psychological blow. It felt as if their entire country was under a microscope. The sense of secrecy and security, once their greatest strength, was gone. They were living in a glass house, and the enemy was watching their every move, a feeling of utter strategic nakedness that bred paranoia and despair. Finally, the impact transcended the military and began to poison the very ideology of the state. Tolkachev didn't just provide technical data, he provided cost overruns, production reports, and candid assessments of the systemic corruption and inefficiency plaguing the defense sector. He showed the Americans how the Soviet command economy, groaning under the weight of its own contradictions, was being bled dry by the arms race. This economic intelligence was perhaps the most powerful weapon he delivered. It allowed analysts in Washington to see the Soviet Union not as a monolithic superpower, but as a hollow giant. US policy shifted. The Reagan administration, armed with this knowledge, could now confidently push the Soviets into ventures they knew they couldn't afford, like the Strategic Defense Initiative. The KGB, the guardians of the state, could only watch as American policy seemed perfectly designed to exploit the specific, secret weaknesses of their economy. They were fighting a war on two fronts, one against a phantom spy they couldn't find, and another against an economic reality they could no longer deny. The ultimate symbol of their failure was not a smoking gun or a captured agent. It was the file for Operation Pauk itself. As the months turned into years, the file grew thicker and thicker with reports of American triumphs and Soviet setbacks. It was filled with intercepted communications, satellite photos, and defectors' reports, all pointing to a massive intelligence breach. But one section remained almost completely empty: the list of suspects. There were no leads, no patterns, no clues. The file was a monument to their impotence. For the men of the Second Chief Directorate, that empty file sitting on their desks became a symbol of a terrifying new truth. They were no longer the masters of the game. They were players in a game whose rules had been rewritten by an enemy they couldn't see. By 1982, the situation had escalated from a crisis to a full-blown institutional cancer. The Politburo, the aging, iron-fisted rulers of the Soviet Union, were now directly involved. Secret, high-level meetings were convened in the Kremlin, not to discuss Wu-year plans or grain harvests, but to confront the humiliating reality that their most vital military secrets were being stolen on an industrial scale. The mood was no longer one of professional concern. It was one of cold fury and thinly veiled panic. Yuri Andropov, the formidable head of the KGB and soon-to-be General Secretary, personally took charge of the investigation. In a closed-door session, he reportedly slammed his fist on the table, demanding an end to what he called this ideological treason. The realization had finally dawned on them. This was not a series of isolated leaks. It was a sustained, strategic assault by a source so well-placed and so well-protected that he operated with complete impunity. They were forced to officially acknowledge that their enemy had established a permanent intelligence beachhead inside the very heart of their defense apparatus. Every new American weapon system, every new NATO tactical doctrine seemed purpose-built to counter Soviet strengths. They were no longer in an arms race. They were in a race against an opponent who had stolen the finish line. The KGB was no longer just hunting a spy. They were trying to save the state from a strategic catastrophe of their own making. The KGB's response became a case study in desperation. Thrown off balance and stripped of their usual methodical approach, they began lashing out with a series of frantic and ultimately futile countermeasures. First, they doubled down on the brute force tactics that had failed them before. Operation Pauk was expanded, swallowing thousands more scientists, engineers, and military officers into its maw of suspicion. They conducted mass arrests, rounding up anyone with even the most tenuous connection to the West or a hint of dissidence in their past. Innocent men were sent to the Gulag to create the illusion of progress. This only deepened the paranoia and crippled the research institutes, as brilliant minds became too terrified to collaborate or innovate. Second, they turned to technology. The 7th Directorate's technical wizards were ordered to invent a device that could detect clandestine radio transmissions. They deployed vans packed with sensitive antennas, which roamed the streets of Moscow day and night, hoping to sniff out the spy's communication with his handlers. But the CIA's burst transmission technology was too advanced. The signals were too short and too infrequent to be triangulated. Tolkachev, guided by his case officers, communicated only when and where it was safe. The KGB's ghost hunt with their electronic nets caught nothing but static. Their most desperate gambit was to try and trap the phantom. They initiated complex dangle operations, deliberately feeding falsified documents into the system, hoping the traitor would pass them to the Americans. They laid elaborate surveillance traps around potential dead drop sites in parks and along the Moscow River. But these measures were doomed from the start because they were based on a fundamentally flawed assumption. The KGB was hunting for a CIA case officer using classic espionage tradecraft. They envisioned a spy in a trench coat, leaving chalk marks on lampposts. They never suspected the truth. The spy was one of their own elite, a man who didn't need elaborate signals because his access was total. Tolkachev didn't have to break into safes. He had the keys. He didn't have to photograph documents in secret. He took them home in his briefcase, part of his normal work. Warned by the CIA about the falsified documents, he simply ignored them. He avoided the staked-out dead drop sites because his handlers told him to. The KGB was playing chess against an opponent who could see the entire board, while they were blindfolded, swinging wildly in the dark. Their every move was anticipated. Their every trap was sidestepped. The failure was total and deeply humiliating. The psychological impact on the men of the Second Chief Directorate was devastating. These were agents who had been raised on a diet of ideological certainty and institutional infallibility. They were the sword and shield of the party, the smartest and most ruthless men in the Soviet Union. Now they were failing, consistently and completely. Morale plummeted. The long hours, the constant pressure from the Kremlin, and the absolute lack of progress ground them down. Burnout was rampant. Officers began to drink heavily. A deep, corrosive cynicism took hold. They had always believed in the superiority of their system, but the daily evidence of the Phantom's success was a powerful counter-narrative. He became a legend within the Lubyanka's corridors, a nameless, faceless spectre of American ingenuity and their own incompetence. He was the ghost in their machine, a symbol of a deeper sickness they couldn't cure. For the average KGB counterintelligence officer sitting through another fruitless, smoke-filled briefing, the conclusion was inescapable. The Americans had a weapon they couldn't understand and couldn't defeat. The crushing weight of this realization was not just professional, it was existential. If they, the Guardians, were so easily outwitted, what did it say about the strength and vitality of the entire Soviet project? They were horrified to find that, for the first time, they had no answer. The story of the Phantom of Moscow, the ghost who walked through the KGB's walls, ultimately connects to a truth far larger than a single brilliant espionage operation. Adolf Tolkachev's betrayal was not merely a security failure, it was a symptom of a terminal disease at the heart of the Soviet system. The intelligence he provided did more than just expose military secrets. It exposed the fundamental weakness of a command economy struggling against the relentless engine of American industrial and technological innovation. Each roll of film he passed to his CIA handlers was a detailed indictment of the Soviet project. The documents revealed a system rife with corruption, crippled by inefficiency, and technologically years, if not decades, behind its rival. While the Kremlin was projecting an image of monolithic strength, Tolkachev was showing the CIA the truth. The giant had feet of clay. This knowledge was the ultimate weapon. It allowed the United States to calibrate its Cold War strategy with devastating precision, pushing the Soviets into an arms race they were economically destined to lose. The KGB was hunting a man, but the true enemy was a reality they could no longer deny, the stark, overwhelming contrast between the vibrant, innovative power of the American system and the decaying, hollow shell of their own. The ultimate demonstration of this verdict was not a triumphant parade or a decisive battle, but a quiet, bitter moment of irony. In 1985, after 8 years of operation, the ghost was finally caught. Yet the KGB did not catch him. Their multi-year, 1,000-man investigation, Operation Pauk, had yielded absolutely nothing. They were as baffled on the day of his arrest as they were on the day they first discovered the leak. Tolkachev was captured because his identity was given to the KGB by a traitor within the CIA itself, the infamous mole Aldrich Ames. It was a Pyrrhic victory for the masters of the Lubyanka. They got their man, and after a brutal interrogation, they executed him with a single shot to the back of the head. They could finally close the file on the Phantom, but it was too late. The damage was irreversible. The nearly 1 million pages of secret documents Tolkachev had provided had already been absorbed and weaponized by the West. The knowledge of the Soviet Union's deep structural weaknesses was now a cornerstone of American policy. The US had spent the preceding years building weapon systems that perfectly countered every new Soviet advance and launching economic policies that squeezed the Soviet economy until it broke. The arrest of Tolkachev was like shooting a messenger after the message had already been delivered, and had brought an empire to its knees. The system he exposed continued its inevitable decline, and just 6 years after his execution, the red flag was lowered over the Kremlin for the last time. The Soviet Union, the fortress that couldn't find a spy in its own house, had ceased to exist. In the end, the story of Adolf Tolkachev is an epilogue to a clash of worlds. The Soviet Union built a state on the foundation of total control, a society walled in by fear and surveillance, run by a KGB that believed in its own omniscience. They were convinced that their system, brutal as it was stronger, more disciplined, and historically inevitable. But they were horrified to discover that the greatest threat was not an invading army, but a simple, powerful idea in the mind of one of their own. Tolkachev wasn't motivated by money. He acted out of a profound ideological conviction that the Soviet system was a moral and historical dead end. He saw the stagnation and the lies, and chose to align himself with the dynamism and the relative freedom of his nation's adversary. The KGB could never comprehend this motivation. They saw only treason, never the cause. They were baffled by a man who looked at the two systems and calmly decided that theirs deserved to lose. The final verdict of the Cold War was not written in treaties, but in the quiet courage of individuals like him. The American reality, with all its flaws, proved more powerful than the Soviet ideology, not just because it could build faster planes and more powerful computers, but because it could inspire a man, sitting in the dark heart of the enemy's empire, to risk everything to help it win.